research looking at the intersection of nationalism and ethnicity and religion in the development of the modern nation state. So, without further ado, hand it over to Robin.
So hi, good afternoon, y'all. I'm here to introduce Dr. Diwan. As she stated earlier, she is a researcher at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. She works in both comparative politics and international relations, and she specializes in Arab and Islamic policies and politics in the Persian Gulf. So her current projects are concerned Gulf political economy, the politics of sectarianism, generational change, and the evolution of Islamism in the GCC, all of which I'm sure will come up today. She was previously an assistant professor at American University in DC and received her PhD in political science from Harvard and did her master's at Johns Hopkins. And so we're going to learn a little bit today about changing generations, and specifically in Saudi Arabia. So please help me welcome Dr. Diwan.
Thank you, Robin. Is this ready to turn on? If I need it. Thanks, Robin, for the kind introduction. And Robin mentioned that I did my PhD and my master's degree, which she mentioned I did my undergraduate degree at Baylor. I'm actually from Texas, grew up in San Antonio, so I feel like this is kind of a homecoming. It's really exciting to be back in Texas. I'm really happy to be with all of you here. The presentation I'm going to give to you today, or the things I'm going to be talking about, I've titled it Generation NBS, Understanding Social and Political Change in Today's Saudi Arabia. Because he's been so much in the news, maybe most of you know who MBS is. MBS is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, young Crown Prince. Stands for Mohammed bin Salman, King Salman being the king in Saudi Arabia. And I'm going to be talking to you a lot then about society inside of Saudi Arabia, even some culture. I'm hoping if we can get the audio visuals to work, I was going to show you a couple of videos. And the intent in going into this kind of society and culture is a couple of things. One, when you're looking at a state like Saudi Arabia, cultural politics are important. I mean, cultural politics are politics, right? So if you're trying to think about shifting the politics in the state, you're having to shift kind of the culture and the terms of understanding and identity inside of the state. So that's one thing I'm going to be looking at a lot. And the other main thing I'm going to be doing in this presentation, why I'm going to be going more in depth in what's happening inside of the state, is that I think to really understand what's happening in Saudi Arabia, both in terms of the dynamics that are taking place inside the state, trying to understand some behavior that may look a little strange from outside, which is coming right now, obviously off of the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. So to try to understand some of these things, as well as kind of more assertive policies that Saudi Arabia is taking in the region, so things that actually impact on their regional posture and even relations with the United States. I want to try to make a kind of a strong argument that a lot of this is really can be shifted, or you can get a lot of insights about this from understanding the generational transition that's happening in Saudi Arabia right now. And that's both in terms of the society and also in the leadership as represented by this young crown prince. I've been going to the Gulf for a long time. I've been studying the Gulf for almost 20 years now and going back and forth to the Gulf states. I spent a lot of my early research going to the smaller Gulf states, the Gulf Littoral, and Saudi Arabia was kind of a hard country to get into. When I had my research scholarship, in fact, I couldn't go into Saudi Arabia studying political science at the time, so I kind of looked at it from afar. But I got invited to go there in 2011, and since that time, I've been going to Saudi Arabia every year. So I've been, thinking about Saudi Arabia and traveling there now for many years. And when you think about the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia in particular, I'd say there's kind of an informed conventional wisdom from experts about how kind of the state is set up and how it works. And I'll name just a few things if you're thinking about it. One, it's a dynastic monarchy. This is how we traditionally think about Saudi Arabia. And when I say dynastic, what I mean by that is there's power sharing amongst the elites. So you have the king, who's obviously the most important actor in the state, but he shares power with, traditionally, it's been a lot of his brothers who hold kind of important positions within the government, Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior, these kind of sovereign positions. And there's some kind of consensus that allows them to kind of rule along the state. The second thing, of course, it's a petro-welfare state. The wealth is coming primarily from the hydrocarbon sector, and they're able to use the wealth that they get from oil to help in the rule, right? It comes directly into the state. That's then shared in different ways, both within the ruling family itself, with elites within the state, people who are close, businessmen and the like, and as well distributed them to the population through state employment, benefits, these sorts of things. So that's kind of a really key way as well as how the monarchy has maintained power. The other key element is the religious establishment, which has been very important in Saudi Arabia and is unlike the other Gulf states because the Al Saud came to power in a sort of alliance with basically a revivalist movement in Saudi Arabia, which is commonly known here. I mean, it was under a cleric named Muhammad ibn Wahhab, and so it's known here as Wahhabism. And that's been not just the ideology of the state, but very linked in through kind of religious police and stuff, through enforcement by religious police into forms of kind of social control within the state, and also enforcing political loyalty. So this is kind of what a lot of experts would tell you, kind of how the state functions politically in a kind of thumbnail way. But what I'd say is, even from the time I've been going there in 2011, thinking about it before then, you can see growing weakness in this kind of functioning of rule in all three of these areas. You had kind of through this power sharing a real sort of ossification of decision making, even some kind of, you would think, kind of parasitic relationship of the kind of the way that the wealth was taken by these different elites. Something that's shared across all the Gulf states, a real need for economic diversification, not really being able to have the state function just on terms of sort of reliance on the oil sector over time. And then some kind of loss of control or weakening sort of legitimacy over the religious sector as well. That can be demonstrated by kind of the rise of even like extremists, even jihadi movements, some of them that had their roots in Saudi Arabia. So just kind of an inability to keep control of the whole kind of religious discussion and what was coming out of the state in that regard. So problems kind of weakening in that whole sort of system, if you will. From the perspective of the young Saudis that I met and started to talk to in 2011, even before, if you ask them about the problems of the state, a lot of them would tell you that the leadership is old. They would just stress that it's really old, geriatric almost. And I remember right around 2011, which of course is the key year, the time of kind of the Arab uprisings, this one Saudi journalist I know who was running a blog at the time wrote a blog where he very simply just tallied up the age of all of the ministers in Saudi Arabia and averaged them. I think at the time it was like 69 years old. And if you look at the population in Saudi Arabia, it's overwhelmingly really young. This is the total population, so this includes migrant workers, which is kind of interesting that you see the kind of imbalance you get with a lot of the single males coming into the country. But for political reasons, this is really what you want to focus on. And you can see very much that we do have this youth bulge, and that's really centralized, actually though, interestingly enough, right now, right in this generation, which is basically the millennials, that are coming of age and entering into public life looking for jobs and stuff in Saudi Arabia right now. And I want to argue that this generational division that you had between the leadership and this new generation, culturally is really important. And that this whole issue of generational change is important. And I don't think generational change is always important. Not all generations are politically strongly relevant. I'm a member of Generation X, so speaking from experience, caught between baby boomers and the millennials, we haven't been a generation that's had a lot of kind of power and influence. But I'd say in the Gulf, this new generation of millennials is really important to think about because of the challenges that they're making for the state. One is that they're large, like I said, really large generation, even more than the one before or the one even coming after. And the most important thing, I think, is the shift in the information environment, right? So we're talking about the rise, and of course this is a global phenomenon, of social media, web-based technologies, WhatsApp and these kinds of technologies like this. And I'd say that these are both important for instrumental reasons, for the way that people can communicate inside of the state, and also for normative reasons, the way that it really shaped this generation to have a different kind of outlook and thinking. And like I said, I think this is a really global phenomenon, but I think it's even more pronounced or critical in a state like Saudi Arabia, where the public sphere is so controlled, and the cultural environment has been so controlled. So having this kind of device, ways to communicate with each other, to mobilize, to think about things differently, has been really, really impactful, especially in a state where these devices are really readily available. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, if you look at it, it regularly comes up as one of the top countries in the world in terms of YouTube usage, Twitter usage, these sorts of things. They're very available and very prominently used. And of course, you also have the phenomenon of a lot of Saudi students through this King Abdullah research program coming and studying in the United States. You've had hundreds of thousands of Saudis who have come here and had that experience as well. So all of these things, I think, made this new generation of Saudis think about things different. I mean, you get a real divergence in outlook of the generations. And this, when I was looking at Saudi Arabia, became very public, very visible, not necessarily in we're talking about like the mid-2000s or so, in the public life. It was very much online. You could see this different culture emerging. You saw kind of an underground culture and a real clear evidence of a kind of youth dynamism. And one example of that is the emergence of these sort of YouTube collectives that would produce these sort of satirical videos, commenting on Saudi life in a funny way in terms of both kind of social norms, political realities. So I want to show you one of these just to give you an idea of the flavor of it. This is from a YouTube collective called Telfaz 11. The 11 was linked to 2011, actually. The program was called La Yakthar. Read it. Maybe back up just a little bit. And this, the guy who ran it, his name is Fahad al-Butari. I chose this actually because Fahad actually studied at the University of Texas. He studied here. Sorry, I'm not quite ready for it. Just one more setup. Sorry. I just want to give you one more setup for the video so you can understand it, the context. This video was made in 2011 when the Arab uprisings were happening and the king was trying to find some way to kind of react to that and do something for the public. And at the time they decided to bring back the municipal elections, which had been delayed. They hadn't had them. They were supposed to have them 4 years after the initial elections in 2005. They didn't have them because they didn't much like the way they turned out. So they decided to bring back the elections in 2011. But although there was a big campaign by women to participate in the election, they decided, no, they can't participate, but we'll let you participate in the next ones that happened. So this is just kind of their amusing, Telfaz 11's amusing take on kind of the irrelevance still of the elections for the Saudi public. So I'll let you watch it. It gets a little involved, but we'll give you a taste of what they're producing.
كذا مقابلة مع أحد مستشارين غير ناخب ويعني كذا أسئلة تحس في شراء أو كذا يعني شرط على أي أحد ما تفرق معه أي أحد يشارك قبل شكرا.
You saw at the beginning there to be people coming to vote in the elections.
مساعد. لا لا
سلامات.
سلامات يا عمي يا شباب. ولا شيء ولا شيء عادي. وراه ذا وراه.
I'm gonna just skip a little bit. Apologies for forgetting this guy.
خذوا لقاء ولا شيء. طبعا الرجال طلع من جد ما يسجل غير ناخذ بس الظاهر الشباب يبون يسترون عليه او شيء الله يستر عليه. على العموم احنا بابنا مفتوح نقابل اي احد يسجل غير ناخذ مع المكان وعادي إيه. لا يا ابن الحلال ما يلا.
Anyway, I wanted to show you that to give you kind of a flavor for the kind of funny way, low production value, but these became hugely popular. These were getting millions and millions of views. And you have to think of it in terms of Saudi Arabia where, at the time you didn't have films, you don't have a lot of public entertainment. So this kind of viewpoint being expressed on social media or YouTube was really something new and very engaging. And I want to talk a little bit about something that emerged from there at this time, just to show that basically through this kind of online, and also in certain areas, you start to then see these kind of pockets of youth culture that are quite strikingly different from the dominant culture in Saudi Arabia, which was still very controlled kind of by the religious police and the kind of social restrictions. And you get instead kind of youth voices finding their way in a way that has some kind of more social force and even political potential. So this is a picture from a bookstore that was operating at that time in Jeddah. And there at this bookstore became kind of a site where a lot of young people would come together to have kind of intellectual discussions. They would have book club kind of things. Volunteering got organized a lot out of here. There's been a big problem in Jeddah with floods. And you had young people getting together and organizing basically to do supplies and kind of to help out with the floodings that took place through the kind of connections that they were making initially online and then through this bookstore, this kind of bookstore. They actually decided to run a young person as a candidate in the municipal elections. At one point kind of have their own youth candidate. And it's interesting that through doing that, they were creating something that was very different than the existing political kind of groups, informal groups that you had in Saudi Arabia. And they then became perceived as sort of a threat, right? And so you had right around 2012 then this case of a young writer who used to write for a newspaper, Hamza Kashgari, who kind of based on these conversations that I was having in this private setting, kind of getting at different sorts of political views and stuff in the dominant culture, tweeted, which of course Twitter now public, kind of his reflections, and this was during the Mawlid, so kind of a holiday for the Prophet. And I won't go into the detail of what he tweeted about, but it was sort of a little bit kind of a Sufi understanding of things and his relationship to the Prophet Muhammad. Now this was seen in Saudi Arabia as completely scandalous. It got blown up hugely, this kind of viewpoint that was being expressed. And there are immediately calls for Hamza Kashgari to be executed, basically for blasphemy, arrested and executed. He actually fled the country, but was brought back, expatriated back to Saudi Arabia, and then he was imprisoned actually for almost 2 years. And I think this shows kind of in a way how there was a disjoint between a lot of the youth culture that was in some pockets developing and the broader culture in Saudi Arabia, and also how they kind of could be seen by some of the dominant political trends, a lot of them Islamist trends, as being somewhat of a threat in this context. And here we're talking about like around 2012, right? So at the same time we had these shifts in the kind of public culture in Saudi Arabia, linked to this generational shift. We had a really important generational shift in the leadership. If you think about Saudi Arabia, basically it was founded by Abdulaziz ibn Saud. Since that time, the state was founded in 1932, every ruler of Saudi Arabia has been a son, a direct son of that founder of the state. It's basically just been getting younger and younger and younger sons, true even till today. But we're basically like reaching that period where you just can't biologically, there's no more sons left. So it's exactly at this time, what I'm saying is we're reaching a really critical time in generational transition in Saudi Arabia, where it has to pass from the sons of the founder to the sons of the sons. And this has a lot of political relevance because obviously when you do that, you're trimming kind of the whole power of the ruling family more down to one line, right? Which means that some elements of the ruling family are going to be shunted from power. And that has a lot of, in terms of all of the wealth and influence and stuff that involves. So what I'm saying is that this particular shift at this time, it didn't have to be a point where we get a lot of centralization in power in Saudi Arabia. But on the other hand, it makes a lot of sense. There's a certain logic that this is the point in which we would see a consolidation under kind of one line of power. And that's exactly what we saw happening under King Salman, who took over under King Abdullah. He appointed for the first time then 2 members from the next generation. Initially the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, who was the interior minister, very well thought of, very powerful, holding the reins of the interior ministry, very well respected and liked in Washington, where he was involved in a lot of kind of counterterrorism and seen as somebody on top of things in the kingdom. And then below him, though, he appointed like a deputy crown prince, his own son, who was not well known at the time, and that's Mohammed bin Salman, who was only like 32 years old, I think, at the time. But immediately he gave him the position of Minister of Defense and also head of basically the economy through a newly restructured economic body, and that includes the oil sector. So he had already kind of set that up, and within like a year or two, you had the removal actually of Mohammed bin Nayef and almost a complete kind of concentration of power then under the king and this very young son, Mohammed bin Salman, which is really unprecedented. I talked at the beginning about this whole idea of a dynastic monarchy. We're into something quite different. If we think about what the young crown prince did, coming from the same generation of change that I was describing in society, one of his first things he does then, within months actually, is Saudi Arabia intervenes in Yemen. It was launched in March 2015. And Mohammed bin Salman, as the Minister of Defense, is very much the public face of this campaign. It's given the name Decisive Storm. I don't know why the English translation is wrong. In Arabic, it's also Decisive Storm. And in fact, this whole idea of decisiveness becomes the watchword, the key word of the whole new reign in Saudi Arabia. And it was very, I would say, I think it's hard to judge popular opinion in Saudi Arabia without a public, but I'd say this was broadly kind of seen as popular at the time, the intervention in Yemen. There was a lot of pent-up frustration in Saudi Arabia at the time of the failure of anyone to intervene in Syria. People had been watching kind of the deaths and kind of killings of people in Syria, and there was a growing sense that Saudi Arabia needed to be more active and intervening in the region. And Yemen was kind of a way, people saw it was kind of, Syria was too hard to intervene in, but Yemen was somewhere where Saudi Arabia could move. And counter what they saw as kind of a rising Iranian threat. And we can talk about that perception and how much it makes sense in terms of Yemen, but that's the way it was definitely portrayed. And the outcome of this then is something we see a lot building from this intervention, something that had already been starting before, and that is the whole idea of like a Saudi nationalism. Oh, before I get to nationalism though, which I'll talk about, I wanted to add something here with you because I know you're probably much more interested in the regional policy. Another important thing that emerged very much under the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, as well as the Yemen intervention, is this very strong, powerful alliance between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. This came, one, through the really closeness that we saw between the young Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and the Crown Prince of the UAE, who's the effective ruler of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed. And you could see through Mohammed bin Salman a clear admiration for a lot of things that the Emirates had done in terms of their own cultivation of a national identity or nationalism, their economic diversification that they'd achieved. If you think about like Dubai and even increasingly Abu Dhabi, kind of a much more future-oriented identity projected through technology and the arts. All of these you can see as elements of kind of the plan that Mohammed bin Salman is trying to do in Saudi Arabia. And for the UAE, Saudi Arabia became a really important partner to increase, it's a small country, a somewhat effective country, but small, increasing the UAE's strategic depth and their ability to project power in the region. And I think really they have had a very strong strategic vision for what they want to do in the region. We could go more in depth in that. And they're perfectly happy to execute that in alliance with Saudi Arabia. And we could see that expressed very much in the Yemen war, where they were the two principal countries intervening. And you can see the extent of where the kind of popular, again, projection of this alliance. This was during Saudi National Day. I just put this up here. The Emiratis were actually stamping passports when you entered the UAE, saying, so we're celebrating Saudi's National Day, saying that we're together forever. Like you can see, I mean, actually, you go to the embassy, and you go into the UAE, you get a stamp about Saudi Arabia. This is like a Saudi sign, actually, on your passport. So that just tells you kind of the extent to which they were cementing this alliance and kind of publicly expressing that. And this projection of kind of influence that the UAE has extends not only through Yemen, but also into the Red Sea. We've seen a lot of intervention and a kind of a port strategy, not only through Aden, which has been rather problematic, but also in East Africa. UAE has been involved as well in kind of resolution of peaceful things between Eritrea and Ethiopia, ports in Somaliland. So much more power projection that this alliance has kind of allowed them to do. And we'll talk later about Qatar, which is another element of that. So for Saudi Arabia, we see then a lot more kind of this nationalism being projected. And this whole idea, I mean, if we think about nationalism, obviously this is a global trend. So this isn't just in Saudi Arabia. There's much more concentration of thinking in terms of national identity is everywhere. But I think in Saudi Arabia, it's very much seen as getting the country out of a particular bind. For Saudi Arabia, I think over time they'd started to see a much greater threat from transnational groups, whether they be different Islamic groups. You could think in terms of extremists like jihadi groups, but also political groups that were seeking different kinds of forms of political visions, Muslim Brotherhood kind of linked groups, or even from youth movements. So we see 2011 and the kind of ideas that were brought in within the country through that. And so there's needed kind of a new frame to kind of constrain and work against these transnational movements and to allow for a different kind of somewhat participation under the framework of the ruling family. And I think nationalism has really provided that. And it also provides a frame for demanding more from citizens, right? Because once you start promoting nationalism, if you're moving into an arena where you have economic diversification, you want people more, so you're not going to give them jobs in the public sector, you need them to work. If you're going to go to work in Yemen, you need them to serve in the army. This is a frame for asking for more from Saudi citizens. The Sahwa refers to kind of the shift from a bit of a more Islamic identity that the state had, and kind of a rejection more of that, not complete Islamic identity, but this kind of Islamic revivalism that they had before, in favor of a Saudi nationalism. And I have one video just to show you how this new nationalism then merged very much with this appeal to youth and a youth culture. So this is Saudi, not that one, this one. This is Saudi National Day in 2017 in the main street in Riyadh. This is taken from a cell phone, so you can't see very clearly. But you get a sense of it. It's pretty much like a public rave. This is, I can promise you, not what earlier generations of Saudis are used to seeing publicly in Saudi streets, men and women jumping up and down, dancing. Music was forbidden in Saudi Arabia. This kind of activity is really unusual, and I think gives you kind of a sense of the degree to which they were wanting to use kind of this new national identity and link it very much to this burgeoning desire for young people for more kind of entertainment and activities. So if you look at the way Mohammed bin Salman's been doing things domestically then, in addition to that, we have kind of the whole structure of the appeal that they're doing in terms of a cultural opening. Of course, to be able to have even that kind of rave in the streets, we're talking about a rather serious pullback in the authority of the religious police who used to patrol and not allow for exactly that kind of behavior to take place. At the same time, this is being driven by economic needs, really strong needs to start to bring women more into the workforce. If you need to get more employment, women's employment is very low in Saudi Arabia. You need to bring women more into the public sphere. To do that, you need to have a cultural shift. So women kind of being more seen publicly and stuff is part of the centerpiece of this shift. Also embracing kind of a more creative class, entertainment, we can talk about that, tourism, these sorts of things, both as economic initiatives and also things for it to entertain this younger generation. We can see very much how Mohammed bin Salman then, relative to earlier leaders, is not so much relying on the old pillars, but on a very new kind of structure within the kingdom. So I want to show you just one more video that gives you a sense of the flavor of this. This isn't actually a state-sponsored video, but it gives you, again, kind of the sense of the women's kind of energy that's been part of this new order. This is a music video, so enjoy. The young kid diving in. This is before women could dive in. It's really dark. It's called the House of Men. Get in the back seat. We can probably stop it there. Gives you an idea. So I think that gives you some idea of kind of the release of kind of women's energy and stuff in the public sphere. We'll talk in a minute. A lot of these things I've been talking about are kind of positive in the sense of the outreach and stuff to women, but there's been some very kind of troubling or difficult things in this new character of the new Saudi nationalism. One thing we could talk about, kind of almost referring to this as a hyper-nationalism. At the same time that we've seen kind of a little more social openness and a real desire to link to this younger generation, that doesn't at all mean a political opening. And there was a really, really concerted energy in Saudi Arabia to have a complete control, have everything be sort of state-led over the whole information environment. So if we're talking about a lot of this energy that was coming from social media, the open discussion and that kind of thing, this was something that Saudi Arabia and the new leadership really wanted to control that under kind of the line of the emerging nationalism. And I think Qatar is the crisis that was taken in June 2017 against Qatar can be understood to some degree within this. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia argues that Qatar was and the UAE argue that Qatar was kind of threatening to them in terms of their support for, and their media support for groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. But indeed, Qatar had an extensive kind of media presence, right, through Al Jazeera and through a lot of other channels too. I mean, we can talk about Al Arabiya Jadid, which had a very different orientation, a little bit more Arab nationalist, and had a lot of appeal and networks within the Gulf states, and a very connection to young people within Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. And I think the Qatar crisis was very much a way to cut that link. And I talked very much about how saw the threat of sort of transnationalism, other influence, and the desire under this kind of big social and economic transition to have control over the media environment. And Qatar was very much, crisis was able to do that. And by cutting off Qatar, there's also been this real projection of Qatar as very much the enemy of Saudi Arabia. And you can see through social media then a real injection of this kind of thing. It comes to a lot of sort of almost like silly things, like Saudi Arabia's talked about building a big canal between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and turning Qatar into an island. This is the young Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim, kind of sitting alone on his island. That's the humorous aspect of it, but also the whole Qatar crisis was used to control very much social media, so that people were kind of urged, influencing people to support this, and if they weren't coming out in support of it, then they were automatically sort of suspect. So you can see kind of nationalism as a way to enforce kind of loyalty as well. And that we can see very much in terms of what's happened with a lot of political activists. This is a picture of a lot of women that had been campaigning for women to drive. They were then arrested just prior to women being able to drive, which seems a little odd. And they were very much then linked in the accusations against them. Here it says traitor, traitor, traitor. The suggestion at the time was that they had links to some foreign entity with some kind of implication that perhaps it was Qatar. So again, this was a way of kind of a public condemnation of people and bringing people in order under this new national order. And this was also used against a lot of other sort of more Islamic intellectuals, these same kinds of accusations as well. Of course, that feeds in very much to the current Khashoggi crisis of the killing of the journalist in the consulate in Istanbul. Again, we can see kind of the intolerance of dissent within the kingdom, concern that Khashoggi, who had a lot of ties to policymakers in DC and had an influential platform in the Washington Post, would be able to kind of counter the narrative that Saudi Arabia was building. And also, it's interesting to see how the crisis has played out internally in Saudi Arabia, where initially the entire crisis was blamed on Turkey and Qatar, and then when Saudi Arabia has even said that they have been, responsible for the killing, it's still very much linked to ginning up very much, again, the need to have a national defense and how Qatar and Turkey may be using this crisis to threaten the country, and very much like that. And even a lot of actions against Western media too, and uneasiness about the Western media. They've started in Saudi Arabia more recently a boycott of Amazon because the Washington Post, so Jamal Khashoggi was a prominent writer for the Post, and they've been very active in their criticism and in their reporting on the crisis. And of course, Jeff Bezos is owner of Amazon. So, and also you can see kind of the willingness of Saudi Arabia in the midst of this crisis. This was written by a journalist, but you could see kind of the reminder to the United States about the importance of Saudi Arabia in terms of the oil markets and in terms of the battle against Iran, kind of saying, make sure that you still need us, you don't want to go too far in your reaction to this crisis. So I'll just leave it at that and leave it at kind of a question. When we try to think about Saudi Arabia and how it acts, like both regionally and the way it's interacting with its public, I think we need to think a lot more than about if it's turning into something that's really qualitatively different through a few threads that I've kind of pulled upon here. The concentration of power now under kind of one leader instead of kind of a more broad consensual kind of body, mobilization of public opinion, mobilization of public through nationalism, which is very different than monarchies have traditionally worked, right? Monarchies basically want to keep populations pretty much quiet. So this is very different. And I think it will lead to different dynamics that we need to think about in terms of the willingness of the kingdom to be kind of more assertive, and that we can talk about the shifts in kind of even the United States regional posture that allows for this and maybe encourages it in some ways. But anyway, a kind of different kingdom, shifting through the generational shift and the kind of national posture. So I'll leave it there, and very happy to welcome your questions or comments, thoughts. Yes.
The news cycle has moved on, and the Khashoggi killing is not on the front page every day. Can you talk anything about is there any ramifications for MBS, or is there any changes? Are they trying to come up with a new story? What do you think the trend is there?
So the position, the way the certain current posture in Saudi Arabia was an acknowledgement that Saudi Arabia was involved in his killing, that this was kind of an operation that was done by people, some of them who were very close to MBS, but without their knowledge, right? So that's what they're saying, is that the king and the crown prince didn't know about it. And the position that they're playing out very much in the kingdom is they're calling it the kingdom of justice. So it's very much, we will deliver the people who have undertaken this horrible thing to justice. You know, we will do this in full transparency, and we will go after these guys that have now been fingered. I'm not sure, we'll have to see, because obviously this whole posture and even their acknowledgement of their involvement in it came due to international pressure, particularly actually the pressure from Turkey and kind of leaking information, and through the United States. They're still continuing to do that, and I think to some degree it is true that Turkey is very much using this in a way to push for, if not the removal of the crown prince, but at least to damage kind of his standing. There is some competition between Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and also I think Turkey was genuinely, they were pretty close to Khashoggi actually, and probably are, aggrieved by what's happening in their own territory. I don't think we're totally done with the United States yet either. Congress has shown a willingness to be much more assertive on this issue than maybe the executive. It's not totally clear yet. After the elections, that might even be more so. There was already some bipartisan consensus that maybe there needs to be a little bit more pressure. I think it's most likely to come out in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia's posture towards Yemen. So I think we kind of have to see how it plays out. I'm personally quite skeptical that it will lead to the removal of Mohammed bin Salman ultimately. I think his position is quite strong inside of Saudi Arabia. He really has concentrated power. There isn't like other royals that can confront him. There's no more position. I mean, he has the Interior Ministry, the National Guard, all of these defense organizations that once used to be in hands of different royals are now pretty much getting consolidated under one platform and under him. So it would be difficult to remove him. We have seen some royals going back, so there's clearly some sort of discussions going on within the ruling family, but thus far the indication has just been that that's kind of to consolidate support for the ruling family in general and to shore up their positions. So that's where I see things now, but we could see how can we shift.
My question's about Saudi women. So Saudi women they're well educated, they don't share in public life, at least politically.
Nobody shares in political life.
Right.
Or not much. We can talk about the Shura Council and things like that, but.
And given that MBS's message towards women has been mixed, he's granted some rights but jailed other activists. What do you think the future looks like for women in Saudi under the era of MBS?
Yeah. Well, I think at least the current direction, they are determined to create more space in public life in terms of jobs, bringing more women into work, just opening up that public space in terms of social norms a bit more. I think there's economic reasons for that, and also the political direction they're going in kind of that works better. I mean, we've seen appointment of women to kind of prominent positions. It's very much a state-led program though. There will not be anything welcome from a push or activism from below. That's very clear. And the treatment of the women activists is quite severe and uncharacteristic. I'd say for, you know, I wouldn't say Saudi Arabia is ever a politically open place, but the kind of public shaming of them and targeting of them was quite strong. So I think that's kind of where we are right now. It depends kind of how politically things go. I mean, if the hand is really weakened, you could see Mohammed bin Salman shifting tack, but right now I think that's the program that they're trying to follow.
I used to travel a great deal to Saudi Arabia back in the late 70s, early 80s. And
Did it look like that?
I got stories that are just bizarre. Then it was a welfare state. And I used to do business with Petromin, which is east-west crude oil pipeline. It went from the east to the west. And I worked with a lot of Saudis that really didn't have a job. They were paid to sit all day long. They had free health care, they had free education, they had free everything. And so it was effectively 100% welfare state.
Mm-hmm.
Has that changed? And if it is, where are the jobs other than the oil wealth pays people to sit and do nothing?
Yeah.
Is it changing?
Yeah, I think it's changing. There's a need to change, right? Because they can't keep giving everybody those jobs, and I think they see that coming down the pipeline. I mean, when the oil prices got much lower, of course they've gone back up again. It was already looking like a real crisis. So the program is very much to try to diversify the economy, to create kind of new industries that can bring in, create more private sector jobs. To do that, though, they're basically having to put a lot of money. So it's still state-led growth, right? In addition to reaching out internationally for investments. And we'll see kind of where they're left in the current environment. And the Khashoggi thing obviously doesn't make things easier. There were already some questions about kind of how does rule of law kind of work in this place. So I think it's gonna be difficult. And while I've seen a lot of energy and a lot of young people and some desire to do kind of more project-based things, the numbers that you see in terms of Saudis when you look at them and how their real desire and willingness to work outside of the public sector is really low. So it's a big social and cultural shift that has to take place, and it hasn't happened yet. They're basically setting certain industries and saying Saudis have to work there, and they are getting rid of a lot of foreign workers, basically saying like in these fields it has to be Saudis. But thus far, in a lot of those fields you haven't seen Saudis moving in to take those jobs, so it's going to be a difficult process, I think. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on Iran's reaction to the new nationalism in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I mean, I think they see it as somewhat targeted against them. Interesting, Iran, you could see a little bit, I don't follow Iran as closely, but you can see a bit of a parallel thing happening in Iran, to a little bit more of a, in some areas, a kind of a shift towards nationalism too. Obviously, still they have the Islamic State leader, Islamic leadership, so maybe less far than Saudi's starting to go. But in general, yeah, I think that's true. It's funny, I know some people that work on Iran that have actually looked at the movement in Saudi Arabia, at least in the public sphere towards women and stuff, and said, well, we could have some of that in Iran as well, right? But I think generally there's a discomfort with the entire program that the new Crown Prince kind of has, and in Saudi Arabia's posture thus far. I mean, basically, they're the main antagonists at this moment. So. Mm-hmm.
Your view, say, I don't know, 20 years out, whatever, that this transition you're describing has sort of happened in history over and over again, and almost never allows the regime to stay in power. So it either happens radically through revolution or through some constitutional monarchy to democracy, but it almost never remains. What's your perspective on timing and if it'll have change?
course, people have been saying that in Saudi Arabia for a long time now. This can't
But
last.
I mean specifically, these changes start
Yeah.
the process.
I'll say this, I mean, some of the top scholars, I mean, like, I think of like Michael Herb, who's a really good scholar who wrote one of the main books on thinking about monarchies and kind of conceptualizes this whole idea of a dynastic monarchy. I mean, he has an argument that the Gulf states have been really secure and stable because of the dynastic monarchy, because of the power sharing that's happened between the elite. And that if you look at the monarchies that have fallen, whether it be in Libya, Afghanistan prior, some of these other states that may not be perfect cases, they were ones that went more towards this unitary head. So I think if you were using his perspective, he would say that's a dangerous move for Saudi Arabia to make, if my analysis is right and they're sidelining. Of course, MBS is relying on other royals. He's just using ones from his generation that have much less influence and power, well, he's centralizing power. But to the degree that that's happening, you could see more fragility in it, or just different dynamics, right? So, I mean, in this kind of system, when you have now the people that are in charge aren't royals, you can dismiss royals, right? Which is something you see in like Arab republics too. Like this Khashoggi crisis, you can put the blame on people kind of underneath, or, you know, Saudis say that they were the ones, but. Or you've seen some ministers kind of cycled out when the economy doesn't go well. But I think you're right. Saudi Arabia, I mean, they're trying to take a path kind of like what the UAE has done, but they're gonna have a lot less wealth. And they're gonna have to deal with, you know, the way that Islam was woven into the structure of rulership there was very different. So that makes it a much more difficult transition too. So I think it's gonna be difficult. As the economic, you know, if they can't get over the hump of creating the jobs, it'll be tough. But I don't see, Saudi Arabia is not a state where you've had really broad kind of mobilization like you saw in Tunisia or in Egypt, except in the Eastern Province, which we could talk about a little bit. So, and those things take time, right? It takes kind of political movements, connections, experience in doing these things, and I don't see that happening. So I think they have, from that, I don't see like a broad mobilization from below anytime soon in that country. If something happens, it'll be at the elite level. And even that's difficult to imagine at this point. I think MBS can do quite a lot. He can actually mess up quite a lot and still, doesn't mean it may be good for the country if he does, but he could still stay in power that way. Mm-hmm.
I have two questions. So the first one is, what is the state of minorities, especially the
State of what?
minorities,
Mm-hmm.
especially the Shia and Eastern
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia under MBS? And then the second one is the future of the Salafi or Wahhabi groups outside of Saudi Arabia as MBS is trying to move it
Mhm.
nationalist within the kingdom.
Yeah. So Saudi Arabia, traditionally, there's no question, has not been very welcoming for its citizens. There's definitely the way that religion has been woven into the structure of the state. It inherently kind of works against the Shia populations within the country. You did have some elements of kind of an Arab Spring type uprising in the Eastern Province in like 2011, 2012. That was dealt with through arrest and a pretty brutal shutdown, particularly in some towns. Like Alamiya was almost completely destroyed. One town that was kind of particularly rebellious. So they've already gone through a period of kind of some form of resistance. So we could talk in more detail about that. I don't think that was something that was necessarily welcomed by the whole Eastern Province Shia at the time. But in any case, there was kind of a youth-led, effectively, kind of movement there too. Now that that's been effectively kind of shut down, I sense that for Shia populations, they sense a little bit of an opening with a more nationalist orientation. I mean, if you just think of it sort of in terms of ideas and ideology, it does create a little bit more space for Shia. If the state were to move a bit more off of a more Wahhabi posture, curtailing the religious police, and open to a more national position, that's more, could be more welcoming to the Shia. And we have seen some outreach like that. I was seeing like the head of the Muslim World League, Muhammad Ali's side, was talking with some of the Shia leadership about maybe coming and talking there. Some kinds of outreach. They're doing an odd thing in Alamiya where they're rebuilding it for tourism or something, but some kind of investment. Of course, this is not, again, any political activism. It'd be completely shut down. And I have a lot of skepticism because I think the inherent kind of bias against Shia is pretty deep within the Saudi system. But I sense a little bit of a sense of, I don't know how to say optimism, but some sense of potential relative opening in the more system. Did I ask another question that you didn't answer?
Yeah.
Oh, what had this more thought? I think it's really early to say. I think the certain orientation of this national position and some of the actions that have been taken have been actually to curtail that type of investment abroad. I mean, you know, if you think of the classic kind of thing that Saudi Arabia got known for, funding madrasas, Salafi madrasas. If you look at a lot of the transnational Islamic institutions, they're being put under a different kind of leadership with a different orientation that's much more, if you look at the head, Muhammad Ali, for instance, the head of Muslim World League, where he spends most of his time right now, he's like going to the Vatican and talking to Christian groups. He's going in Washington and talking to Jewish organizations and visiting the Holocaust Museum. It's a very different orientation. I think it's a bit early to say, though, what Saudi's Islamic leadership will look like, because that's still something that's very valuable to Saudi Arabia, ultimately. And I also see in a lot of the security organizations, it's still very much coded to the kind of language that you would associate with a kind of more Unitarian Islam. So it depends kind of how this whole transition goes, I think which way that will go, which is unclear. But for the moment, I'd say there would be, the direction is more of a curtailment of that kind of activism abroad that had some links to the Saudi state, yeah.
Saudi Arabia has invested very heavily in its intervention in the Yemeni civil war. But the war has pretty much stalemated, and I'm just wondering, as Saudi Arabia keeps investing more and more resources and energy into its intervention in Yemen, what do you believe will be the impact of the civil war on Saudi politics and specifically on Mohammed bin Salman?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, it was treated very much early on as kind of a way to gin up nationalism. I saw recently, actually, under strain and the kind of strain that the Mohammed bin Salman may be feeling. He was visiting actually with war injured from the war again, which I hadn't seen in a while, publicly kind of doing that again, kind of relying on it for the, which of course is a good thing to do, but also you can see kind of the use of the link to the national identity. But I think generally, I mean, it's clearly problematic. This war has gone much longer than they had expected or ever hoped for it to go. The deaths are really horrific, and the expected humanitarian toll, particularly right now from famine, looks to be, could be really, really, I mean, on a global scale, historic in this coming year, potentially. And that's, well, it cost Saudi Arabia internationally, and people are not happy to see that. So I think there will be some pressure on Saudi Arabia to curtail the war, but I just think the way the Saudis view it is they don't want another Hezbollah-type organization on their border. So I think they just don't feel that they've defeated the Houthis sufficiently enough to strategically get what they wanted from the whole intervention. But I'm not sure where that will play out. Once the international pressure may come to stop that. Because it hasn't been, if that's their goal, it hasn't been effective.
Yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on, I guess, future moves by MBS. He's obviously been very aggressive in the things you pointed out, the Yemen war, the Qatar blockade, Khashoggi stuff. About a year ago, kind of flew under the radar, and he kidnapped the prime minister of another country for 2 weeks, and that just kind of flew under the radar, and he didn't feel really any backlash or consequences from that. I mean, with the Khashoggi stuff, there's been a bunch of moral, vocal outrage, but there haven't
Yeah.
aside from the US, unless US Congress actually does something against arms or war in Yemen, he really hasn't felt any concrete
Right.
backlash from that. So do you think that he might have learned his lesson from this Khashoggi affair, or do you think he's going to continue on, I guess, aggressively in this foreign policy?
If I could just add to that, a couple of princes seem to have also disappeared out of Turkey. I don't know if you're
Mhm.
familiar with that case, but it's been
On
a
previous Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, here we have to think a little bit about the shift in the global environment. I can remember being in the UAE a couple of years ago, and at one of these kind of think tank events where they have different, think tank people coming and talking about the regional order and all that kind of stuff. And I was really struck by the strong presence of Chinese there, Russians there, who spoke fluent Arabic, by the way, in all their presentations, and the Americans were still there in English. And if you think about those states, I mean, this is kind of the new national, more authoritarian order, right? They're not gonna care about these kinds of human rights or sorts of issues are kind of more in line with at least the national framing. And we could look even at our own administration now, taking very much more, even Trump said he's a nationalist, taking less of a focus on that and the real emphasis on burden sharing, right? So the Trump administration shares somewhat, I'd say, in line with the Obama administration, desire to be a little bit less of a heavy footprint in the Gulf, and that's opening up more space for countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia to kind of make their own arrangements. And we've seen the way that they've done it is not, maybe not always to our liking. So I think that it's a global phenomenon, and it's a strategic structural rebalance in the regional politics too that are giving them more space. It has been interesting to see this kind of thing, and I think to some degree, actually, the international outrage over the Khashoggi affair is actually a lot of angst that people feel about the collapse of this international order, and they're like, oh my God, you can do this in a consulate. So I think kind of the more reaction than we maybe even expected is the fear that this is kind of being lost. But I think the longer term trends are there. The debate is going on, I think, in Washington about what this means. I mean, whether he got off without MBS, or does he need to be punished in some way that he feels that this is a wrong move and he could be further constrained or some kind of decision making. But you have to look at the structure that's in Saudi Arabia right now and how much influence and how we can actually achieve that too. So that's kind of where I see things from.
very much on the same
Oh,
line. A year ago, Ben Salman was riding the crest of the charm offensive. He had Thomas Friedman in his pocket. Now he's a pariah. I'm wondering if that makes a difference in terms of his internal standing. And the other question, which is really very maybe a little bit peripheral, but beginning in April, there were rumors that he'd been killed.
Yeah.
And he disappeared, as far as I can tell, from the international scene for a number of months. I wonder if you have a sense of what was behind that. Was an operation of somebody's?
Yeah.
Some kind of a disinformation campaign? What was going on?
I kind of think that exact episode was sort of a disinformation campaign. I mean, I think he had kind of withdrawn a little bit from public view, and I mean, we've seen this a lot. Like, you see something happening that's real, and it gets overinflated, and that's part of the whole dynamic that we've seen with the Gulf crisis. So people are like, oh, he's been killed. And there was an incident in Saudi Arabia where there was like some kind of shootout that happened at one of the...
In April.
Right. So people linked those two things and said, okay, he was injured or he was killed. I mean, I was watching really closely the Saudi public sphere, and he had, since that episode, he had actually been out and visited a cleric, and you know, there were videos of him with his cleric very publicly shown. So that's why I think it was overplayed. I think it was played by kind of, in a way, a disinformation campaign, or just people over-speculating.
People inside Saudi Arabia who were opposed to him, is this a sign of an internal opposition? Or what do you think?
I mean, we can't really know. The explanation that was put out at the time about the gunshots is that it was somebody flew a drone and people overreacted. It's possible, but there's no question, it's actually possible that it was a drone and the people overreacted. But there's no question he's worked up a lot of opposition within the ruling family. I think just deductively, you could think that that would be the case. He's disenfranchised a lot of people, he's jailed a lot of people, you talked about people missing. And we know that if you look at the reporting right now, I mean, if you just look at what reporters, how they're reporting on the Khashoggi thing, they're getting a lot of leaks from ruling family members, actually, not publicly. I mean, they're not sourced, but they're sourcing it to people within the family. So you can see there's dissent within the family. I'm watching really closely, and I don't see that structurally rising to a level that's as yet threatening him.
Outside the family, is there any sense of a political space that matters in this matter?
There's no political space right now. I mean, I don't know. I feel like some weird thing about like voicing these kinds of things, but I think the more likely thing if somebody wanted to eliminate him would be a very high level assassination or something. I don't see like a mobilization, that kind of space. I don't see it. And in the current crisis, they're doubling down on the kind of national rhetoric. We've seen just in the last few days, perhaps some openings in the ruling family. Prince Ahmed came back, who was one of the senior, like a son of Abdulaziz, came back from London. We saw a couple of princes released that had been detained since the whole detainment that happened about a year ago of some elite business people and royals. But it seems to me, at least I'm trying to watch this closely, it looks like they're being released to help solidify the family and not, at least we don't know yet that anything's being kind of planned to try to create some body that might constrain his decision-making. I've heard a lot of rumors about that, but I haven't seen anything yet. And the people that are being released are coming out very strongly supporting MBS. I mean, not the people who were released, but we had like a brother, I think, of Awali bin Talal was released, and then he came out and we did that interview with Bloomberg or CNN, where he very much said MBS is in power and we support him, that kind of thing. So
Khashoggi's son was also quoted in the press, and we could weight that by the circumstances.
yeah, I mean, they were released, but they've been very cautious in their comments as well. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you one more question? Can you touch on Saudi Arabia's warming up to Israel and how they're going to sell that to the public?
Mm-hmm. It is pretty public that Saudi Arabia has been in close negotiations, or one of the main interlocutors with Jared Kushner as he's planning the new kind of deal of the century, if it's ever going to come out. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I think, and of late, we could talk about Oman too, but particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, it appears, have been taking the strategic decision that the main issue for Saudi Arabia right now is Iran, and in that particular struggle, Israel is almost an ally. So I think both the value of Israel, perhaps in that struggle, and the value of Israel as a conduit to have closer relations with the Trump administration or with the United States, has been driving this kind of closer relationship. The Jerusalem decision made that much more difficult, and I think that's one area where we have seen a little bit of separation between Mohammed bin Salman and the king. I think that was one issue where the king came out and was kind of publicly very, very critical about the Trump administration to move the embassy to Jerusalem and the moves since that time. But I think, again, this kind of more national posture, you can kind of see the logic again that Israel then is less of a problem in a weird way, and issues kind of like pan-Arabism or that sort of thing are not as operative on the leadership level. I think you're right, they do still have to deal with it with the population, but I've seen small ways they're trying to prepare the population a little bit for a shift. They've gone a bit back and forth depending on what the Trump administration has done, but they've had a few, you've seen kind of some op-eds in the paper, like Palestine issues, been overplayed kind of thing. And I think one indication that the public might not be where they are on this, where some of their thinking is kind of interesting. You can look at Kuwait, which probably is the one state that has the most openness in terms of politics, or at least some ability to express what the popular interest is. in Kuwait's the one state in the Gulf which is not at all gone. Has been very strong against any kind of normalization with Israel, and it's very much kind of trumpeting support for the Palestinians. But I do think on a strategic level, the leadership, at least in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are seeing that differently.
Yeah, I just was curious to know, so have you seen a trend of support for political censorship among Saudi youth? I've noticed this recently, and I don't know if you have as well.
Well, that's part of the national identity thing, right?
Right.
So if any dissent is being shown as something that's injurious to Saudi Arabia and of their public standing, you shouldn't speak critically about, Saudi Arabia. And that does have some support. And again, it's really hard to measure Saudi public opinion because in this environment, it is very orchestrated. I go to Saudi Arabia a lot, so I definitely know that there are people that are very believing in this and are excited actually by the idea of Saudi Arabia becoming a more kind of prominent player and the Saudi national role and that kind of thing. But I wouldn't want to say what the broader public feels about that. But yeah, there's definitely it's punishable, right? So if you do speak out about Saudi Arabia, you will pay for that. But you do have kind of orchestrated, very strong reaction against that. I'll give you just one example. We brought some Saudi filmmakers recently to show some works that they had done, really, really interesting stuff. That's at least like socially critical. One's name is Mishal Al-Jasser. He did a short film, you know that film? Samayati Going to Hell. It was very critical of sort of, treatment of foreign workers. And he got pulled out, while the film was showing, he had stepped out, and a Saudi woman came up to him. He talked about this publicly during the presentation, that in the break that she had come to him and really told him, why are you doing this? You're presenting a really ill image of Saudi Arabia. You shouldn't be doing this. People won't make that distinction about how you're presenting the country. So there's definitely the sense that they're under threat, that they need to be projecting a unified positive image. That obviously is then enforced as well by the political structure right now. Anything else?
Question.
Sorry,
no worries. This is kind of like a broad question in general. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about Saudi relations with the United States, considering the diversification of the economy, the social reforms, and also if there is a increased outcry in the international community about Yemen, so just generally.
Yeah, it's a difficult trying to answer that question right now, because the orientation has definitely been very much courting much more international investment in Saudi Arabia and international investment in these new fields, right? So fields of entertainment, technology, the Crown Prince's huge project that I'm so enthusiastic about is this new city, Neom, which is supposed to be like a futuristic city, which completely will rely so much on foreign kind of investment and technology to come into the kingdom and that sort of thing. So the energy has really been there, which you could see when the Crown Prince came and visited the US. His tour, he spent more time in Silicon Valley and Hollywood, actually, in these places than he even did in Washington. So you can see the direction of where he was trying to take things. But those are exactly the kind of fields that are more, I would say, they would be kind of more sensitive to these kind of image type things, right? I think finance, oil is going to stay around. So it could, the Khashoggi issue, and like you said, Yemen, they should be attentive to that, because ultimately there's a requirement of that. I think they're going to need that foreign investment to make the kind of changes that they're saying that they want. And it's not totally clear yet if this is going to be something that will blow over, and then the money and the opportunities will be there, and then people will respond to that. But it doesn't help the campaign that they were clearly undertaking for the last year and a half, what they've currently done.
Oh gosh, so within this sort of development of the social sphere, so pre-Mohammed bin Salman, but also with the filmmakers that you're seeing, is there, within sort of this millennial generation, is there a push towards stepping across regional, language, religious boundaries to talk to the other side?
Yeah, my sense statements from the main proponents of the Arab Spring, and I'll put that in really broad quotes right now in the Gulf, is that the key energy behind that was exactly that. It was kind of breaking beyond the traditional boundaries that they have in religion, and political groupings within the states. So you saw like members of Sunni Islamist movements, but reaching out a bit and interacting with Arab nationalists or new Arab nationalists that were trying to build bonds between Sunni and Shia. So you saw a lot, and they were kind of the key energy in a lot of the movements, I would say. And you can see that in the films, like I just described, kind of to try to have more empathy for foreign workers and that kind of thing. These are kind of cultural elites. They're reflective of a certain move that some would like to see. I'm reluctant to say that that's kind of a majority position in Saudi Arabia. But it does have some resonance with at least some of the direction that Mohammed bin Salman wants to go. Which I think speaks to why some of these people, even though uneasy, may have like a mixed feeling, like, well, we're hoping this will go well, but we're not sure completely. But yeah, I guess that's it. Anything else? Great. Well, thank you. I'm happy to stay after if anyone has any other questions or thoughts, or I'm just happy to meet you too. I'm really glad to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.